Calvin Douglas had always been the kind of man who respected boundaries, the invisible lines that made neighborhoods function smoothly. A quiet professional in his 40s, he had purchased his dream home in the gated Willow Creek Estates community, a place run by one of the most notoriously strict homeowners associations in the county. Perfect lawns, matching mailboxes, and color-coordinated front doors, that was the HOA way. He had worked for years to afford that home, not just because it was beautiful, but because it represented everything he'd built through patience and discipline. But in Willow Creek, not everyone shared that same sense of respect. The first few weeks had gone well enough. Calvin greeted his neighbors with polite smiles, waved when passing by, and tried to stay out of the HOA constant drama. But there was one person he had learned to avoid early on, a woman named Karen Whitmore, who lived 2 houses down. She was the unofficial self-proclaimed enforcer of the neighborhood, a middle-aged woman with sharp sunglasses and sharper opinions. Karen had an uncanny ability to appear whenever someone's trash can was left out too long or when a guest parked slightly past the curb. She called it maintaining community standards. Everyone else called it meddling. Karen's husband, Todd, was quiet and rarely seen. Most of the neighborhood interactions were purely Karen's doing. She hovered near driveways like a hawk, clipboard in hand, ready to report even the smallest violation to the HOA board. Calvin had endured her small talk a few times. She'd often ask pointed questions about his work, his guests, or his landscaping, as if testing him for mistakes. He knew better than to engage. He'd just smile, nod, and go about his business. But one Friday morning, something felt off the moment Calvin pulled into his street. His garage door was closed, as always, yet something told him he wasn't alone. Maybe it was the faint tire marks on the driveway, ones that didn't match his own car's pattern. He parked by the curb and walked toward his home, unlocking the door. As he passed through his kitchen and reached for the remote to open the garage, his gut tightened. The sound of the door lifting echoed through the air, and as sunlight poured in there, it was. A white Lexus SUV sat parked neatly in his garage. At first, Calvin thought he was hallucinating. He blinked, waiting for logic to catch up. The car wasn't his, nor had he given anyone permission to park there. He stepped closer, his heartbeat steady but heavy. The vehicle was spotless, expensive, and very familiar. He'd seen it before countless times driving around the neighborhood. Karen's Lexus. Calvin exhaled sharply and rubbed his forehead. He wasn't angry yet, just baffled. Maybe she had parked there by mistake. Maybe there was an emergency. But as he walked around the vehicle, his suspicions grew. The garage door sensor light blinked red, meaning it had been closed manually from the inside. That meant she hadn't just parked there quickly, she'd actually used the remote to shut his garage. Calvin walked out into the driveway and looked toward Karen's house. Sure enough, her driveway was empty. He shook his head in disbelief. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered. He wasn't the kind of man who liked confrontation, but this crossed a line. He picked up his phone, dialed the HOA office, and asked to speak with the property manager. The woman on the line sounded cheerful until he explained what happened. "I'm sorry, Mr. Douglas," she said, hesitating, "but residents sometimes make temporary parking arrangements if their own driveways are being serviced, without asking the homeowner." Calvin interrupted calmly. "Well, technically, they're supposed to get written permission, but if this was a misunderstanding..." "Oh, it's a misunderstanding, all right," Calvin said, "one I'm going to fix." He hung up. A few minutes later, Calvin saw Karen walking out of her house carrying a shopping bag, her blonde hair bouncing in the sun. She looked startled when she noticed him standing in front of her car in his garage. "Oh, Calvin," she called out, forcing a laugh. "You're home early. I was going to leave you a note." "A note?" Calvin repeated, crossing his arms. "About parking in my garage." She smiled, waving her hand dismissively. "My driveway's being pressure washed today. Todd forgot to move my car before the workers came, and I didn't want the chemicals to splash it. I figured you wouldn't mind. It's just for the afternoon." "Without asking," he said evenly. "Oh, come on," she said, chuckling as if it were silly to be upset. "We're neighbors. You have 2 garage spaces, and I only used one. Don't be so uptight. It's not a big deal." Calvin stared at her for a long second. He could feel the quiet storm building in his chest, the kind of indignation that comes when someone strips away your right to be respected. "Karen," he said slowly, "that's not how this works. You don't just take someone's property because it's convenient. You should have asked." Her smile faltered. "Are you serious right now? You're making this sound like a crime." "Maybe not a crime," he said, "but definitely disrespect." She rolled her eyes. "You're being dramatic. It's just a garage. Relax." Then she turned to leave. Calvin said nothing more. He simply watched her walk away, then looked back at the car sitting arrogantly in his space, like a symbol of everything wrong with people who thought rules only applied to others. He didn't call the tow truck. He didn't argue. He just stood there in silence, thinking, and that's when the idea hit him, quiet, brilliant, and poetic in its simplicity. He smiled faintly, stepped into his garage, and pressed the remote. The door rolled shut, locking Karen's Lexus safely inside. Then he walked back into his house, packed a small travel bag, opened his laptop, and booked a spontaneous 10-day vacation to Puerto Rico, something he'd been meaning to do for months. By the time the confirmation email hit his inbox, the decision was final. He wouldn't tell Karen. He wouldn't warn her. She'd learn the hard way what happens when you treat people like they don't matter. Later that afternoon, Karen returned, expecting to grab her car. She rang Calvin's doorbell, but there was no answer. She knocked harder, frowning. The garage door remained firmly closed. "Calvin," she called out. "Hello, are you home?" No response. By evening, she was pacing in her driveway, calling the HOA office, demanding someone open his garage. But the association reminded her gently that they had no legal authority over a homeowner's private property. That night, Karen's frustration turned to panic. She left voicemail after voicemail, each one more frantic than the last. "Calvin, this isn't funny. I need my car. I have an appointment tomorrow. Can you please open the garage? This is harassment." Her tone shifted from entitlement to desperation, but Calvin wasn't home anymore. He was on a plane, sipping coffee, watching the world shrink beneath him as the clouds rolled by. He didn't do it out of cruelty, he did it out of principle. People like Karen needed reminders that respect was not optional. And maybe, just maybe, 10 days without her precious Lexus would teach her that lesson. Back in Willow Creek, word spread quickly. Neighbors whispered over fences and on social media. HOA members quietly laughed behind closed doors, secretly rooting for Calvin. Even Todd, Karen's quiet husband, seemed oddly unbothered, telling another neighbor, maybe it's good for her to take a break. By day 3, Karen was red-faced and furious. She threatened legal action, called locksmiths, even tried to file a police report only to be told it was a civil matter. Meanwhile, Calvin was lounging on a balcony in San Juan, enjoying the ocean breeze. His phone buzzed constantly with notifications, messages from neighbors, from the HOA, from Karen herself, but he ignored them all. For the first time in months, he felt peace. The sunset painted the sky gold, and as he watched the waves crash below, Calvin smiled. Some lessons, he thought, are worth the price of a plane ticket. By the third morning, the peaceful hum of Willow Creek Estates had shifted into quiet chaos. Neighbors whispered as they walked their dogs, glancing toward Karen's house as though watching the aftermath of a suburban scandal unfold in slow motion. Everyone knew what had happened. Everyone, except Karen, seemed to find it oddly poetic. Karen stood in her driveway again, pacing like a restless storm, clutching her phone in one hand and her HOA clipboard in the other. Her Lexus, her prized, spotless, pearl white SUV, was still locked inside Calvin Douglas's garage, and there wasn't a thing she could do about it. Every call she made to Calvin went unanswered. Every message she left grew louder, longer, more desperate. "This is ridiculous," she shouted that morning, startling a passing jogger. "He can't just trap my car like that. That's theft." The jogger gave an awkward half-smile and jogged faster. Karen gritted her teeth. She turned toward the HOA office across the street, where a small board meeting in session sign hung in the window. She stormed across the road, yanking open the glass door with unnecessary force. Inside sat three members of the HOA board: Linda, a soft-spoken retired teacher; Rick, a middle-aged accountant; and Melanie, the HOA president. They were in the middle of reviewing landscaping budgets when Karen burst in. "Do you people even know what's happening in this neighborhood?" she barked, slamming her clipboard on the table. Melanie adjusted her glasses calmly. "Good morning, Karen. What's the emergency?" "The emergency," Karen said, almost hissing, "is that one of your homeowners has unlawfully imprisoned my vehicle in his garage, and you people are doing nothing about it." Linda blinked. "You mean Calvin Douglas?" "Yes." Karen threw her hands up. "He locked my Lexus in his garage. It's been 3 days. I've called him, texted him, emailed him, and he's completely vanished. I can't get to work. I can't pick up my dry cleaning, and my HOA isn't helping me." Rick cleared his throat. "Karen, as we've explained before, that's private property. The HOA doesn't have the authority to enter another homeowner's garage without permission. That's absurd," she snapped. "We're the HOA. We manage this community." Melanie folded her arms. "We manage community regulations, not personal property. If Mr. Douglas has gone on vacation, you'll have to wait until he returns." Karen's face turned crimson. "Wait? You expect me to wait? He took my car hostage." Linda sighed softly. "Did you ask his permission before parking there?" Karen froze for a moment. Her lips tightened. "I was going to leave him a note." "So, no," Rick said flatly. "That's irrelevant," Karen argued. "We're neighbors. He should have understood it was temporary. A decent person would have been considerate." Melanie leaned forward, her voice low and deliberate. "Respect goes both ways, Karen." The words hung in the air like quiet thunder. Karen's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. She grabbed her clipboard, muttered something under her breath, and stormed out of the office, slamming the door so hard that Linda's coffee nearly spilled. Outside, she stood by her empty driveway, staring across the street at Calvin's perfectly silent house. Curtains drawn, lights off, everything pristine. The locked garage stood like a silent monument to her frustration. That evening, Todd came home from work carrying a brown paper bag with takeout. He found his wife sitting on the front steps, glaring at Calvin's house. Still no luck. He asked carefully. Karen didn't look at him. He's playing games and the HOA won't help me. Todd sighed and sat beside her. You shouldn't have parked there in the first place. She shot him a sharp look. Excuse me? I'm just saying, you could have asked him first. Calvin seems like a decent guy. You know how particular he is about his property. Karen's voice rose. I didn't need to ask him. It was one afternoon, and now look at this. He's turned it into a circus. Todd didn't respond. He just opened the bag quietly and handed her a sandwich. Eat something. You've been pacing all day. Karen crossed her arms, refusing the food. He thinks he's teaching me a lesson. Just wait till he gets back. I'll have the HOA fine him for harassment. Todd looked toward Calvin's house, then back at his wife. You might be the one who gets fined. Karen gasped. Whose side are you on? The side of peace, Todd said softly, taking a bite of his sandwich. But there would be no peace that night. By morning, Karen was back on the phone, trying to get the local police involved. When the officer arrived, a tall, patient man named Officer Ramirez. He listened carefully as she explained her version of events. His expression remained neutral. So let me get this straight, he said finally. You parked your car in your neighbor's garage without his permission, and now you're upset that he left town and locked it. Karen hesitated. Yes, but it's not that simple. It sounds pretty simple to me, ma'am, Ramirez said, scribbling something in his notepad. You technically trespassed onto his property. Trespassed, she repeated, scandalized. It's just a garage. We're in the same HOA. That doesn't change the property line, he said calmly. This isn't a criminal matter, it's civil. You'll have to wait until he returns. Karen's voice grew shrill. So you're saying there's nothing you can do? The officer smiled politely. I'm saying you should probably start using public transportation for a while. Her jaw dropped. This is unbelievable. You're all useless. Officer Ramirez gave a sympathetic nod and left. Karen watched him drive away, her hands trembling with fury. She turned toward Calvin's house and muttered, "Oh, you think you've won, don't you?" But the truth was, Calvin wasn't even thinking about her. Thousands of miles away, Calvin was sitting at a small cafe in Old San Juan, sipping a cold drink while the sea breeze brushed past him. He hadn't planned this trip to be petty. It had turned into something else entirely. It was peace, something he hadn't realized he'd been missing. He'd rented a beach-front apartment, spent his mornings walking the shoreline, and his evenings listening to live music in the square. Every now and then he'd glance at his phone, see dozens of missed calls, and smile faintly before putting it back in his pocket. He refused to let Karen's chaos invade his calm. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, his phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from an unknown number, a neighbor. "Hey Calvin, just wanted to say, you're kind of a hero right now. Whole blocks talking about how you handled Karen. You've got the patience of a saint." Calvin chuckled softly and replied, "Just enforcing community standards." Meanwhile, back in Willow Creek, Karen's situation grew worse by the day. She'd borrowed Todd's car, but her obsession with the Lexus, her symbol of control and pride, was consuming her. She began camping out on the porch at night, flashlight in hand, waiting for Calvin to return. Neighbors stopped waving. Some even crossed the street to avoid her. On the sixth day, Melanie from the HOA stopped by with a cup of coffee and an olive branch. "Karen," she said gently, "why don't you just let this go? When Calvin returns, apologize. It'll blow over." Karen shook her head violently. Apologize for what? For being a responsible homeowner who needed a safe space for her car? Melanie sighed. For assuming the rules don't apply to you? Karen's face darkened. "You're taking his side too." "I'm taking the side of reason," Melanie said. "Look around, Karen. You've turned this neighborhood into a spectacle." Karen stood abruptly, her voice trembling with rage. "He humiliated me. Everyone's laughing at me." Melanie looked at her for a long moment, then said quietly, "Maybe they're not laughing at you, Karen. Maybe they're relieved someone finally stood up to you." The words cut deep. Melanie turned and walked away, leaving Karen standing alone in her driveway, staring at the closed garage door as though it were her reflection, locked, silent, and unyielding. By the 9th day, the tension had reached its breaking point. A crowd gathered at the weekly HOA barbecue in the park, where talk of Calvin and Karen dominated every conversation. Todd tried to blend into the background, embarrassed, while Karen ranted to anyone who would listen. "He's going to regret this," she fumed. "You'll see." But as night fell, headlights appeared at the end of the street. A sleek black car rolled in, stopping in front of Calvin's driveway. The crowd turned as the door opened. Calvin stepped out, tan, relaxed, a faint smile on his face. Karen froze, her heart pounded. He was back. The neighbors went silent. Even the cicadas seemed to hush. Calvin walked slowly toward his front door, keys in hand, glancing briefly at Karen as if she were a mere afterthought. "Welcome back," someone whispered from the crowd. Karen stormed toward him. "Where have you been? Do you have any idea what you've put me through?" Calvin stopped at his steps, turning to face her. His calmness only made her angrier. "I took a vacation," he said simply. "You took my car on vacation." She snapped. He raised an eyebrow. "No, Karen. You parked your car in my garage without permission. I just happened to leave town afterward. That's theft," she yelled. He tilted his head. "Then maybe you should call the police again." Her jaw clenched. "You think this is funny? You embarrassed me in front of the entire HOA." Calvin looked her dead in the eyes. "No, Karen, you embarrassed yourself." The crowd murmured softly, the truth landing heavier than any insult. He turned, unlocked his garage, and pressed the remote. The door rose slowly, revealing the untouched Lexus, gleaming under the lights, spotless as the day she parked it. He stepped aside. "Your car's safe. You can take it now." Karen stared at it, her chest heaving, torn between fury and humiliation. She said nothing. She just walked past him, climbed inside the Lexus, and drove off without another word, but everyone saw the red in her eyes. Calvin watched her go, then smiled faintly at the murmured applause from his neighbors. He didn't say a thing. He didn't need to. Sometimes silence was the sharpest response of all. The following morning in Willow Creek Estates began quieter than usual. The sun rose over manicured lawns and identical mailboxes, but something in the air felt different. The gossip had cooled, replaced by a strange sense of collective reflection. For the first time in a long while, the neighborhood's most feared woman, Karen Whitmore, wasn't making her morning rounds. Her clipboard was missing from her porch. Her blinds were drawn tight. Calvin stood in his kitchen, sipping coffee as he watched the street through his window. He wasn't interested in gloating. He wasn't that kind of man. But there was no denying the satisfaction that came with peace and quiet. For 10 days, he had escaped both the noise and the nonsense, and it seemed the lesson he had left behind was still rippling through the community. His phone buzzed. It was a text from Melanie, the HOA president. "Good morning, Mr. Douglas. When you have a moment, could you stop by the office today? We'd like to talk." Calvin raised an eyebrow but replied simply, "Sure thing." An hour later, he walked into the small HOA office by the park. The air smelled faintly of paper and coffee. Melanie sat behind the desk, and Rick and Linda were there too, looking oddly cheerful. A folder sat neatly on the table. "Calvin," Melanie said warmly, "welcome back. I hope your trip was relaxing." "It was," he said with a smile. "Peaceful, actually. What's this about?" Rick leaned forward, hands clasped. "Let's just say your situation with Karen has sparked quite a discussion in the community." Calvin chuckled softly. "I figured it might." Melanie exchanged a glance with Linda before continuing. "The HOA board has decided to review several of our policies, particularly regarding member conduct. It's come to our attention that certain residents have been overstepping boundaries. We realize that sometimes rules can't protect people from entitlement, only accountability can." Calvin listened, quietly impressed, and Linda added, "We've also had several residents request that you join the HOA committee as a community liaison." Calvin blinked. Melanie nodded. "You've handled this situation with more restraint than most of us could have. You didn't retaliate, didn't escalate. You let consequences speak for themselves. That kind of composure is what this neighborhood needs." Calvin laughed softly, shaking his head. "I'm flattered, but I don't know if I'm HOA material." Rick grinned. "You might be the only sane one among us." Melanie leaned back. "Just think about it. We'll send over some paperwork later." As Calvin stood to leave, Melanie added, "Oh, and Karen filed an official complaint against you." He stopped mid-step and turned slightly. "Of course she did." "She claimed you held her car hostage," Melanie continued. "But after reviewing the details, including her own admission that she parked without permission, the board voted unanimously to dismiss it." Calvin nodded slowly, unsurprised. "I appreciate the fairness." "Fairness," Melanie said, smiling faintly, "is something we're trying to rebuild here." Outside, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the street as Calvin walked back home. He could already feel the shift in how people looked at him. Neighbors waved more sincerely. A couple walking their dog stopped to say, "Good for you, man." Even Todd Karen's husband gave him a quiet nod as their paths crossed near the mailbox. Todd paused awkwardly. "Hey, Calvin, I wanted to apologize for everything." Calvin raised a hand. "You don't have to. None of this was your doing." "I know," Todd said, rubbing the back of his neck. "But she crossed a line. She's realizing that now. The HOA told her they're reviewing her membership privileges." It hit her hard. Calvin exhaled, neither happy nor vengeful. Maybe it's what she needed. Todd hesitated, then added, "For what it's worth, I think you did the right thing." Calvin gave a small, genuine smile. "I just did what anyone should do, stand up for respect." Later that evening, as dusk fell over Willow Creek, Karen finally emerged from her house. She wasn't wearing her usual bright clothes or carrying her clipboard. Instead, she wore a simple sweater, her posture smaller, her steps slower. She walked up the sidewalk toward Calvin's driveway. Calvin saw her through the window but said nothing, simply opened his front door as she approached. "Karen," he said evenly. She stopped a few feet away, arms folded, her eyes darting to the side. "I didn't come here to fight," she said quietly. "I just wanted to say something." Calvin nodded, waiting. "I was wrong," she said after a long pause, "about the garage, about the way I acted. I let my position in the HOA get to my head. I thought rules gave me power, but really I just made everyone hate me." Calvin said nothing, letting her words hang in the cooling air. "I used to think I was keeping the neighborhood perfect," she continued softly, "but I was just controlling it. When you locked that garage, I realized how powerless I felt, and maybe that's how I made others feel all the time." She looked down, her voice cracking slightly. "I'm sorry, Calvin, truly." For a moment, the two of them stood in silence. the hum of crickets filling the space between them. Then Calvin said, "It takes courage to say that." Karen nodded. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted to say it." Calvin's tone was calm but firm. "Karen, I don't hold grudges, but I do believe people should learn from what happens to them. The best apology is changed behavior." She gave a small, weary smile. "I know, and I plan to." She turned to leave, but before she reached the sidewalk, Calvin called out softly, "Karen." She stopped and looked back. "For what it's worth," he said, "I never wanted to embarrass you. I just wanted you to understand boundaries." Karen nodded slowly, message received. As she walked away, Calvin closed his door and leaned against it, letting out a long breath. For the first time since the whole ordeal began, he felt something unexpected: closure. Days turned into weeks. The HOA atmosphere began to change. Karen stepped down from her volunteer post, choosing instead to focus on her garden. Neighbors began greeting her again, cautiously at first, then with genuine warmth. She wasn't the same as before, quieter, humbler, even kind. She started waving to Calvin when they crossed paths, and though he didn't always wave back, there was no bitterness left in him. At the next HOA meeting, Melanie announced a new community policy. All residents must obtain written consent before using another's property for any reason. The rule drew quiet laughter and a few knowing smiles. Calvin was officially elected to the Community Relations Committee that evening unanimously. He accepted, not out of pride, but out of purpose. If people like Karen could change, maybe the whole HOA could too. That night, as Calvin walked home under the streetlights, he passed his garage, that quiet witness to the entire saga. He stopped for a moment, smiling faintly. Funny how something so simple, a locked door, could change the way people saw themselves and each other. Across the street, Karen stood watering her plants. She noticed him, hesitated, then raised her hand in a small, respectful wave. Calvin returned it. Maybe peace was finally possible in Willow Creek Estates. He entered his house, placed his car keys on the counter, and poured himself a glass of water. Through the window, he could see the soft glow of porch lights, the gentle hum of a neighborhood at ease. For once, the HOA wasn't a battlefield, it was a community again, and as Calvin turned off the lights and headed upstairs, he couldn't help but smile, because sometimes the best revenge is restoration.
If you liked this story, please like, subscribe, and share it with others so they can learn something from it too.